to Virtual Book Signing. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and as always, we're here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. And it's a gorgeous day. We actually have a few people here with us, and we're happy to have C-SPAN join us. Thank you very much to be here. And Illinois Channel has been here, and Liz Taylor from the Tribune Literary Book Section is with us. And we appreciate all of them being here. Also, Voice of America is covering us today as well. Well, the Lincoln movie is out, I've heard, and so here we are with two books, two authors, and two books that are related directly to the movie. Tony Kushner, of course, lives in New York City, the recipient of eight Pulitzer Prize, 2 Tony Awards, an Emmy, the Critics' Choice for Best Adapted Screenplay, and of course he's up for an Oscar in just 9 days. And frankly, it should win, at least here in the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop it certainly should, because it made a different statement than anyone else has in all of these years on Lincoln on film, and made the biggest difference, I think, than other films that in their own genre I don't think have the same impact as this one does. He's the author of Wunderbar, illustrated by Maurice Sandek, co-edited Wrestling with Zion. His plays include Angels in America, Homebody Kabul, and Caroline or Change. His screenplays include Angels in America for Mike Nichols and Munich for Steven Spielberg. And of course, today's book is the screenplay for the Lincoln movie, and it's a foreword by Doris Kearns Goodwin. The Theater Communications Group publishes it, 164 pages, $30 for cloth, $15.95 for the paperback. And you can order while we're live or a little later on as well. We'll have signed copies for you. As well, we have Harold Holzer. I think this is his 3rd or 4th time on. A senior vice president for external affairs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, co-chair of the U.S. Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. May it rest in peace. Has authored or co-authored 44 books on Lincoln and the Civil War, and is a specialist in Lincoln and Civil War imagery and the go-to guy for the media on anything Lincoln. He has a nice artifact collection, too, for that matter, and hopefully we'll get you on Artifact Whisperer. He won the Lincoln Prize for Lincoln and Cooper Union. He's also won the Barondess Award 4 times, the Nevins Freeman Award here at the Chicago Civil War Roundtable, 3 Achievement Awards from the Lincoln Group of New York, and also the James Robertson Young Readers Award from the Round Table of New York. And that really goes right to the book he's done today, which is his latest book, How Abraham Lincoln Ended Slavery in America, a companion book for young readers to the Steven Spielberg film Lincoln. It's a New Market Press for IT Books, division of HarperCollins, 224 pages, illustrated, and is $16.99. And we can get you this signed as well in first edition. Well, thank you both for joining us here at the shop, and have a ton of questions, and I hope some will come in as well. First one is one you may have heard before, but it's first time here, and that is that we now know that Jon Favreau, Obama's speechwriter, has decided to become a screenwriter. So, as a screenwriter, do you think you can become Obama's speechwriter for a change?
I don't think I would make a very good political speechwriter. I think that there are requirements for that job that I like patience and willing to be severely edited and writing on deadline and so on.
Well,
you
put some wonderful words into Lincoln's.
Well, I did my best, and as I've said before, I think that we have a president at the moment who is really capable of writing very beautiful speeches all on his own, a couple of really wonderful books. So it's nice to have a real writer back in the White House.
All right, well, just another screenwriter coming out, though. Does Spielberg
Maybe after he's done being president, he'll become a screenwriter.
Could happen.
He's young. I mean, he could do anything.
If anyone is interested, I'm available to be either as presidential speechwriter or a screenwriter. I'm just waiting
or
for
a president.
Maybe he'll follow John Quincy Adams. We go back into Congress. Tell us about your relationship with Steven Spielberg and how the film and you as a screenwriter, you're the 3rd one on the movie, and how did it change from what Spielberg was doing in the first place and what he asked you to do?
Stephen originally was thinking of this as being a sort of general film about the Civil War, and then met Doris at the point that she was working on Team of Rivals. He bought the rights to Team of Rivals and sort of read it chapter by chapter as it was coming out. By the time he asked me to take a look at Team of Rivals and consider adapting it, he had really moved from thinking of it as being a film about the entire Civil War to being a film very specifically about Lincoln, which is where I think his heart was always. He's said many times that as a kid, he was fascinated by Lincoln. He was very frightened when he was taken to the Lincoln Memorial as a little boy, and he thought the figure was this kind of giant, scary figure. And then he looked into the face and felt that it was a very kindly face, and it sort of had a big impression on him. So I think when we first started talking about Lincoln, he told me that one of his earliest memories of Lincoln was cutting out a black cardboard silhouette of Lincoln on President's Day in second grade. And when we had our first meeting with Daniel Day-Lewis, we were at a pub after the meeting was done, after the first day's meeting was done. And Daniel and I were talking by a window, and it was twilight, and Daniel was just silhouetted against the window. So Stephen took a picture with his phone of Daniel's silhouette, and he emailed it to me that night when we got back to the hotel. And it looks like Abraham Lincoln. So it sort of made a circle for him. I think this was something that he'd always wanted to do.
So how did you approach your part of the project? And you certainly had to do a good deal of research in the Lincoln literary field. What were the major influences that you had?
I came to the Abraham Lincoln bookstore for one day. I did, actually, and left with a carton full of books. I began reading what seemed to me the sort of major Lincoln texts. I began reading through the Library of America collection of essays and of speeches and letters. I read a few general histories of the Civil War, and sort of intense. I've always loved 19th century literature, American, English, Russian, French, and I started to, pick and choose American novels from the period and English novels from the period to sort of get more fluent in 19th century spoken language. And I began to figure out how to narrow the story down to something that seemed to me to be containable within a feature-length format, which is only about 2.5 hours, but that was significant enough and in a way emblematic enough to stand in for, to sort of dig into major themes of the Lincoln administration. Because at the time that after I'd read a few books, I began to realize there were certain themes that were going to repeat themselves. They repeated themselves during the 4 years that he was in the White House. And so I began to zero in on the last 4 months, and then with Stephen, after I'd written the account of the passage of the 13th Amendment, we really decided to focus entirely on that.
Well, Harold, you also were brought in very early as a consultant, and tell us your experience with that.
The first experience I had came, I guess it was 2006, when along with a group of Lincoln historians organized by Doris, we all met at a hotel in New York City with Steven Spielberg and Tony Kushner for the first time, and were given 2 wonderful meals in an all-day session and asked, just bombarded with questions about Lincoln, what he looked like, what he sounded like, what his relationships might have been with his sons and with his wife, with his cabinet ministers, how he walked. It was extraordinary. And also thinking process questions, writing style questions. And my now friend Tony was taking notes with a fountain pen dipped in ink. And I thought, we're talking too fast, this is never going to work, it's meaningless. Of course, now he knows more about Lincoln than any of the historians there, and he's one of us. So I think there was a computer at work somewhere, probably his brain. But that was the beginning. And I've known Doris for years and was just enormously flattered that she asked me to participate. There were some terrific people there, Jim McPherson, um, um, Gabor Borit, and many others, and we kicked around so many subjects. The highlight of the meeting for me, and this was really, I don't want to undersell it. It was an extraordinary experience. The highlight came when both Tony and Steven Spielberg were asked by us. We didn't ask any questions until the very end. We actually waited because we thought there might be a third meal, but we were ultimately disappointed. We said, how would you film the Gettysburg Address that would be different from, say, Gregory Peck's stentorian presentation in The Blue and the Gray, or Sam Waterston's whispering it in a railroad station in Gore Vidal's Lincoln, the miniseries? And they went on this flight of imagination that a camera back in the end of the crowd, leaves falling from the trees in November, noise, wind obscuring the words, not everyone paying attention, children rolling hoops on the outskirts of the crowd. And only then, maybe at the last minute, would there be a huge close-up of Lincoln's face, and you hear the final words. And I thought this made it all worthwhile, rather than listening to each other, because we just heard the difference between a screenwriter and a director and mere chroniclers of fact. But then the next thing that happened, obviously, is that Disney and DreamWorks asked me early in the summer to do a young reader's companion book and sort of expand on the evolution of Lincoln's views on opportunity and equality, and they did evolve. He was a flip-flopper in the best sense of the word, and so that was a privilege too.
Well, and you're skipping one important step, which is that after, I think 2 years had passed, and I had a first draft, sometime after the first draft, we contacted you and asked you and Jim McPherson, as well as Doris, to serve as historical advisors for the film. So you were one of the first people to read when Stephen finally said, okay, I think this is getting close to the shooting script, we need to show it to historians and have it checked.
And then we met a couple of times.
And we met a couple of times.
Well, you brought up
which was great. But even though the script came with a lock, and it was like in Get Smart, if you opened it, smoke would come out. It was very protected.
Harold was very unnerved by the fact that every page is watermarked with the names. But one of the things that's been happening recently in the age of the internet is that people in LA go through like dumpsters and they find like discarded drafts of scripts and then they publish them on the internet. So famously, Oliver Stone's movie W, the entire script appeared online the day before they started filming, which is really a nightmare. And nothing leaked from the Lincoln set. We really kept it under lock and key. So there were certain precautions made, but Harold
really loved. Lincoln had, of course, for those who don't know, a dream that was significant to him before significant events in his life, like the Gettysburg Address coming, or the Battle of Gettysburg, or his death, for that matter. He talked to the cabinet that day, how he'd had the dream the night before. And that was a great surprise near the beginning when you had that beautiful scene of him on that ship toward an indefinable shore. But before that scene, just before, was Lincoln with a couple of black soldiers, a couple of white soldiers, and talking to them to him, and reciting the Gettysburg Address to him, and portions of it. And to me, it seemed, and I have a shrink in the audience here, that was part of the dream that he had himself. That his dream sequence, he remembered that last part, told it, but the earlier part was something he was proud of and saw perhaps being embedded into the culture already. And so here we have Mel from Cleveland saying, Tony, did you ever consider having the movie open with Lincoln doing his Gettysburg Address? Well, yes.
Well, originally, when my first attempt to narrow the story down, I started in September of 1863, which is around the time that Salmon Chase, his Secretary of the Treasury, began to make it very sort of publicly known that he intended to challenge Lincoln from within the cabinet for the Republican nomination in '64, and so when we began in 1863 in September, very rapidly I discovered that I could write an entire feature-length script, and I did, and it only got me through about January of 1864. So it was impossible to start that far back. But starting in '63 in September gave me the chance to actually do the address. And what Harold is remembering is accurate. Stephen and I threw around a lot of words. Stephen was ideas about it. Stephen was very interested in acoustical trickery, the acoustical shadows and the war battle would be happening on one side of the hill and people couldn't hear it on the other, and that Lincoln's words at Gettysburg, when the wind changed direction, some people said it was hard, you lost those sentences. I was really struck in Team of Rivals by this account that Doris sort of mentions, that there were these two boys who climbed under the platform and heard the whole thing from. So in my 1863 version, I did have him giving the address, but you're under the platform with these two kids. And they're listening. They can see the bottoms of his feet, and they can hear intermittently some of the words. And they're shocked when it's over in 2 minutes, and then he walks off. And that's the way that you hear the address. I never really. I was absolutely determined that I would get as much of the second inaugural address, as magnificent, as perfect a prose poem as the Gettysburg Address is. I think the second inaugural address is the greatest political speech of all time. I mean, it's just one of the most beautiful prose passages in the English language, and does so much in such a relatively small space. That's what I really, especially the last part, but I really wanted the whole thing in. And that was important to me to hear him do it, and I'm really happy because I think that Daniel, the way that Daniel does it, is a shocker. You think because it's so clipped and sort of almost modernist, and the war came. I mean, it has this kind of steely precision and economy until he gets into the theological part, where it becomes a little bit more expansive. That he must have done the sort of whispering, sort of, which of course would have been inaudible
to anyone.
And what I thought Daniel did, and it was a complete surprise to me, never would have occurred to me, I was jealous that Daniel thought of it, is that Lincoln went to the theater as often as he possibly could. He loved acting and actors, and that he would use 19th century stage language, these big sort of rhetorical gestures when he spoke, and that I think even Daniel does it as somebody who isn't an actor, who is a politician, who isn't doing them with an incredible grace, but with great authority. And I thought that was a real sort of new wrinkle into what we know about.
It was good because he was so, from contemporaries said he was very spare with his gestures, but that he would suddenly do a grand gesture,
right,
and it would look awkward but also dramatic. So with malice, I'm going to cover your face for a second, with malice toward none and charity for all, rings very true as an emphasis that he would make, particularly that at that event, which may have been, except for one Lincoln Douglas debate, the largest crowd he ever spoke to.
Even including some of the soldiers that he addressed in the field, were those were.
He didn't address them when he reviewed them. He would just ride by.
Yeah. These soldiers, of course, the African American soldiers in that scene are veterans of subsequent battles. They were not at Gettysburg.
Right, but veterans of battles where, if they were captured, they would have been auctioned
murdered.
Off into or sent into slavery.
The Poison Spring and Fort Pillow massacres, where the Confederates just decided they wouldn't take prisoners if they captured black soldiers, and
or re-enslaved them, which was
killed them in very brutal and other ways, or re-enslaved them.
I do want to say hello to the Kenosha Civil War Museum, a spectacular museum. If you've never been to it, you should. It's just up north of Chicago, about an hour and a half, and they're online with us today. And as well, my hometown, Highland Park Public Library. Hello, neighbors. Welcome to our shop virtually, and so appreciate all of you being online as well. Someone has asked, Peter from Milwaukee has asked, was there a character in the film that was especially difficult to write for?
No one has ever asked me that. Character was Lincoln.
That's what I
mean, that was the hardest challenge. But once I started doing it, once I got over the fear of doing it, it became easier. Although you have to be very, very careful when you're putting words in the mouth of Abraham Lincoln.
What about someone like Seward? He's a crafty guy.
I loved writing Seward.
So you had no problem?
No, because Seward is, first of all, it's like the difference between, I guess, silly comparison. Seward is obviously, was an immensely gifted politician and an incredible figure, but not I think, I hope his ghost will forgive me, not a genius on the level of Lincoln, and had, in a way, for all of his sort of peacock vanity, the wisdom and clarity to recognize the difference and to sort of,
At the point where you portray him, he understands that Lincoln is the
and
greatest
even
man
sort
of
of
his age.
yes, and one of the things that really you put little quotes on your notebooks and on your the wall of the writing desk. One of them was actually from Bob Dylan talking World War III blues. After he does his little sort of riff on Lincoln, you can fool some of the people. The last two lines are, "I'll let you be in my dream if you let me be in yours," which I thought was sort of Lincolnian in an interesting way. But Seward wrote to Frances, his wife, in this letter very early on. I think it's 1861. He says, "Our rail splitter is a marvel and grows in compassion and authority," I think are the two words he uses, every day. And it's a tremendously interesting insight, because there's this, you can hear what Seward's wrestling with is that this is this guy who has this tremendous authority and power, but also has this kind of, Harriet Beecher Stowe talks about it, sort of feminine, I forget what the bridge cables, but they bend, this kind of yielding, compassionate, introspective side, and that he combines both. He's like Fortinbras and Hamlet at the same time. And I think that Seward found that unnerving, and then it feels to me, in everything that I've read, really began to fall like one of the first great Lincoln obsessives. He sort of fell in love with Lincoln. He couldn't bear, and he was jealous and envious and competitive, but also, absolutely aware that he was standing next to somebody who was unbelievably greater and smarter than he was, and was happy to be his sidekick, his lieutenant. Yeah. So he was a lot of fun to write.
Someone and a question that doesn't usually come up, and I'd like to both of you to talk about this a little bit, is his dad, Thomas Lincoln, shows up in here, and I think it's spot on. I would have nudged it one way or myself, but you say slavery troubled me as long as I can remember, in a way I never troubled my father, though he hated it, in his own fashion. He knew no small holding dirt farmer could compete with slave plantations. He took us out from Kentucky to get away from him. He wanted Indiana kept free. He wasn't a kind man, but there was a rough moral urge for fairness, for freedom in him. I learned that from him, I suppose, if little else from him. So
got the relationship in a
nutshell.
In one speech, right?
Yeah, and I think you did as well. Between the two of you, I think, Tony, you nudged it toward the economic. That's one of the reasons he left, because he could not compete with the free blacks that are coming up.
With the slave owners.
The slave owners.
Slave
yes.
owners, yeah.
In
Kentucky. But I added the little religious. There was this religious fervor that came from his
church,
his Baptist Pigeon Creek Baptist Church, where they had sort of an anti-slavery preacher every week. But then again, when the service was over, young Abe would stand on a tree stump and imitate the sermons and remember them almost perfectly. And invariably, his anti-slavery father would come over and belt him on the side of the head to get him home. So, but there was a religious side to Thomas's
not only religious,
anti-slavery.
but I just think a moral side against slavery. I think that some don't think that.
I think a lot of it, though, as the
not.
movie says, is, Lincoln was always very careful to say, particularly about his Kentucky neighbors, in their place, we would have felt the same thing.
Sure.
It's not that Northerners are more morally right.
The second inaugural address he's facing.
Exactly.
They're absolutely.
Well, then he says,
not
by then,
morally.
it's a national
It's a
national sin.
That's right.
But even in 58 and 60, if we were in their position, we would do the same thing.
Yeah.
He'd try to keep it that. Anyway, I love that passage. I'm glad you read it.
It was important to me to make a distinction, though, that there's a way into there was the abolitionist moral, ethical, religious abhorrence of slavery, and then there was the sort of the Whig position. I mentioned this before. I was a medieval studies major, and one of the jokes in the medieval studies department is, when did the Middle Ages end? And the answer is, who said it ended? And it's hard to know, well, on what date did the Middle Ages, and when does it become the Renaissance? When does it become modern times? I actually, in the middle of this, had this kind of thunderstroke that I think you could make a case that the Middle Ages ended during the American Civil War. I mean, this is this moment when a pre-capitalist, pre-contractual form of societal organization runs right into the demands of the Industrial Revolution and is clearly so utterly out of sync with it. And a lot of the people that Lincoln was surrounded by were people who really rejected slavery, I think, on that, at least as a beginning, on that basis, and whatever kind of moral repugnance they felt wasn't necessarily what they proceeded from. They weren't, it wasn't willingly garrison. It was a different kind of anti-slavery politics, and it wasn't rooted in a deep conversance or friendship or familiarity with slaves, or with former slaves or freed slaves. He really was somewhat. He lived in Illinois, where there weren't very many because of the black laws. I mean, he was.
It was complex.
It's a legitimate point.
It was complex.
A scene that I think shocked many people was Lincoln slapping his son, Robert. How did that come about? That scene.
Okay, I know that I've read somewhere that it may have been in Keckley's book. I'm not sure where.
Keckley mentions it, and
somebody else. There's another.
Well, I did mention that in Lincoln President-elect that when Robert lost the inaugural address, the first inaugural address at a hotel in Indianapolis, forcing Lincoln to jump over the registration desk and throw all these carpetbags up in the air until he found the right one. That would be a good scene in a slapstick comedy. When he got it back, Robert wasn't sufficiently contrite about what he had done. And one report says that he cuffed him, whatever that means. Right. And that's in public, and he's 17 years old and was drinking, we know, on the train journey.
Yes, right.
And so that's another story. So I don't know. They were very indulgent parents. Oh. Particularly with the young boys, as the movie shows. But
yes.
With Robert, it might have been different.
Well, I think there's, the estrangement or the distance between the two of them. And the heartbreaking thing is on the very last day of his life, they had this breakfast where they talked about law as a profession. And Robert, at least thinking back on that, had a sense that maybe they were beginning to come closer. But there's a strong sense that Robert was sort of handed over the difficult, given the responsibility of taking care of Mary in a way while Lincoln rode the circuit, and they were not certainly not close the way that Willie or Tad were close to Lincoln, and he had a temper, and I think that's I think that's an important thing to point out. There are many accounts of Lincoln not getting physically violent, but becoming enormously angry very quickly, and then it passed very quickly. He got control of it, but he
also didn't. He didn't learn to be a parent himself, a father himself. His dad, as we spoke about, he didn't have that, and his dad didn't have one since Abraham was killed by the Indians. Yeah. So there was a string of not having a father figure for them, and I think Abraham learned a little bit more later on when Willie came.
If parents have abusive parents, they either learn to be abusive or they learn to be indulgent. It can go both ways. Yeah. On the subject, I just wanted my theory about the family is that Lincoln actually had two families. He was almost like a man who was twice married and had two different families. He had Robert and Eddie died, and when Eddie died, Mary got pregnant right away, and they had two more sons. And those were the two babies, and Robert was the remnant of the first family. And when Robert was young, Lincoln was off on the legal circuit. They seldom saw each other. And when Willie and Tad had all of his attention in 1860, Lincoln was home through the whole campaign season and off to Washington, living in the White House. So they got the benefit of closeness. Yeah. Also, just because of the physical closeness.
His particular strange kind of closeness.
I should not mention that when I heard someone in the film take up a letter, and I heard the rustle of it, and it sounded like pulp paper instead of rag. That's nitpicking.
Dan, you should absolutely, after all the paper that you have handled from the 19th century, you're entitled to stand up.
I appreciate that.
That paper should not be wrinkling. I told you we had a big crisis because in one of the telegraph scenes, the telegraph operator ripped off a piece of paper from a perforated pad, and I said, wait a minute, when was perforated paper invented? We all went running around looking for the answer that we never found it, but we all agreed it sounds like a 20th century sound. So we got rid of the
But he
pads
really
and just
cares
put-
about those sounds because you've
But
got
see,
the
that's
ticking
exact-
of the watch and the church bell from the church across the street.
But that's exactly it's you care about it
interesting.
in that moment. It wouldn't have mattered if perforated paper. I guess for people who are stationary obsessives, I am one. you might be upset because wait a minute, perforation was
My
invented by
clientele, for heaven's
Mr.
sakes.
Perforation in 1916. Then you have a reason to complain. But the thing that was wrong was not like getting the exact date of perforated paper. It was that the sound sounded to me like a 20th century sound. It sounded, like a noise from our immediate moment, and it didn't feel right for the period. I checked every word in the entire script against the OED, especially words that sounded like maybe. I had this big crisis about is the compound word maybe something that they said. It definitely said perhaps, but it's not clear whether maybe was really in use in the middle of the 19th century. So I don't think they say maybe anywhere. If they do, it's an actor improvising. It's not my fault. But I think it's mostly they say perhaps, and you want to make it so that it sounds plausibly of that time, so that the audience can get lost in that time, and so little pieces of paper were more 19th century feeling at that.
I don't think anybody I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of people who have seen this movie, and whatever perverse delight people are having with little items that they would have written differently. Of course, nobody would have hired them to do the screenplay, but nobody has emerged from this film in less than a reverie of being transported into another era with every bit of the ambience of the 19th century as far as it can be reconstructed plausibly. The sound, the light, the feel, the sensibility, the interaction between men and men and women, which were different and more formal and more structured. Every bit of that grips you from the beginning and carries viewers through. I didn't realize I was such a film critic, but a social critic. But one feels that in the movie.
Well, I think that there are people who have criticized the film, and they're entitled to their criticism in terms of its interpretation. And one of the things I've been asked many times, what did I find surprising about Lincoln? And it's been hard to answer. And then I finally realized, I think it was one of our earlier conversations, the really astonishing thing is the inexhaustibility of the subject. Mm-hmm. That you can read, every 5 minutes there are 6 new Lincoln books. And the good ones always have something new to say. I mean, Douglass said many people say things that are true about Lincoln. Frederick Douglass said after the assassination, many people say things that are true about Lincoln, but no one will ever again say anything new about Lincoln. But he was wrong about that. For all sorts of reasons, this seems to be one of those inexhaustible subjects. So, of course, I knew there are going to be people who absolutely reject our interpretation of Lincoln, our interpretation of his role in ending slavery, our interpretation of his attitudes towards African Americans or slavery. That's all legitimate, but we're presenting, that's not to say that the movie is inaccurate, it's to say that we present one reading of history with the facts presented as they, as far as we know, happen.
With some nice character study.
And with some character study, too.
Otherwise, as I said earlier, we could decide never to read Richard III again because Shakespeare left out the part about burying him under a parking lot.
Right.
Let's have some perspective here.
Well, it's a very dark, intimate film as well, and I love that intimacy and being a part of it, especially on the big screen. I don't think a DVD is going to show that at home, and I love being able to be drawn in and almost in the room itself.
I've watched it on TV. I think it looks great on television.
Yeah, it does.
Buy those DVDs. I never buys DVD.
I'm not trying to stop the
Stream
sales.
that DVD.
No,
or whatever
don't
people
do
do
it.
now.
It does look good on TV.
We don't have much time left, and here I have
Look at all these questions.
scores of questions coming in.
Four
we
score
can't
of
get to them,
questions.
at least. Something I wanted to ask. We had talked about this earlier. I just want to ask again. Here we are, the three of us in the vineyards of Lincoln, holding on to his coattails for dear life. There's a real reason why there's no Millard Fillmore bookshop. So, what is it when we're drawn in to Abraham Lincoln in his time, but him especially? We really fall in love with him. You mentioned love before. And it's easy to fall in love with Lincoln after you get to know him. When I came to the shop, it was in my DNA. I was born and raised here in Chicago, in Illinois. But it was when I came here and started to study him that I said, yes, it's that mythology is the man, and he deserves to be on a pedestal. So how do we keep our objectivity as historians when we have a love for the man?
There are historians who function purely in the anti-Lincoln tradition, and there is an anti-Lincoln tradition that has existed since the 19th century, and people like Mel Bradford and Thomas de Lorenzo, blame Lincoln for everything from the welfare state to imperialism, atomic power, and all of this stuff. But it seems to me inconceivable that anyone can look at the course of events in the 19th century, look at this moment, when the moment met the man or the man met the moment or both, when American democracy was challenged and might easily have died a borning and not been a symbol to light the world as Lincoln wanted, when Americans might have decided to retain slavery into the 20th century. It could have easily happened. When we might not have produced a character who emblemized American opportunity or wrote as magnificently and stirringly and enduringly about what America meant and should mean. The idea that we should pretend ourselves to or assume ourselves to be so sophisticated that that's no longer appealing is sort of sad. And I'm glad that since the bicentennial and the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, and with the explosion of interest because of the film, that by and large people are coming to appreciate Lincoln afresh. And that's healthy even for the body politic.
And I think people should also recognize that there's as much danger in losing objectivity through a determination ahead of time that someone can't be great or can't be greatly good. You're left at the end of Lincoln's life with a string of public utterances, letters, speeches, and then the reports of many, many, many people, some of whom are really reliable or seem to be reliable, and some of whom are really not. And you can really compile a dossier, a brief, indicting him as one of the worst people that ever lived, like somebody like De Lorenzo does, or as one of the greatest people that ever lived. I would argue for that. But if you approach it with an assumption of his unworthiness, you're going to find it difficult to understand some of the places that are ambiguous and as difficult. It's as dangerous, much a threat to interpretation as being too starry-eyed. Cynicism and a kind of unthinking blanket skepticism and a kind of juvenile rejection of any figure of authority as being bad because he or she is a figure of authority is as limited a vision as hagiography or hero worship, and is no more adult or sophisticated, even though sometimes it's sort of dark and sexy. So,
but we're in the post-cynical age, and I think you've done as much.
I hope we're in the post-cynical age.
It's a good place to be.
It's hard work to be cynical all the time. It's sort of tiring. So
this Pepsi is tough.
Yes.
And did they talk about his reaction at the time?
Screamed. There was evidence that he screamed.
We couldn't do it because the place where we were filming didn't actually have the boxes, so we couldn't have Tad run through. But what happened was Pendel, his bodyguard and sort of childminder, was so stunned at first by the news that he didn't look. And then he turned and looked, and Tad wasn't in the seat anymore. And Pendel ran out into the lobby, and he saw it was pandemonium. And he saw Tad running around looking for an exit, which is the thing that makes me just want to weep. I wanted to show Tad's reaction. First of all, I really was happy not to show John Wilkes Booth, one of the worst people that ever lived, in the movie. And also, I thought it was really important to connect the audience to this terrible personal sense of loss, and really it's in a way no more heartbreaking figure in the whole story of the assassination, certainly, than Tad, who really died from it. It just took him about 10 years.
But here it
to
is,
do it.
Aladdin, and if the nation could have one more wish on that lamp, it would be that he could have been the guiding spirit in Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And that's a part of it that I've always thought that it was so ironic that he was seeing that fantasy that day.
Yeah.
Something else that has come up to me a number of times is the ending of the film. The last scenes, his leaving for Fords and Tad and Lincoln in the Petersburg battlefield, going by a Confederate flag, which never would have touched the ground. A souvenir hunter would have gotten that before it got anywhere. That some have thought that it would have ended just before that. What was the collaboration that brought those last scenes together?
Yeah, I've sort of been surprised by that. It's sort of like, well, our movie didn't. I thought it was really absolutely important to show that the assassination happened. I didn't feel that it was a good idea at all to sort of end with him walking off into the twilight, because one of the things that I really find obnoxious is this tradition that, he did his, I mean, I love Walt Whitman very, very much, but, oh, Captain, our ship has weathered every storm, and the prize we sought is won. Well, no, it hadn't been won. Lincoln knew that. He said Reconstruction was going to be a lot harder than the Civil War. And I didn't want to do this thing, this sort of apotheosis approach where he strides off into glory. He was murdered by a lunatic. And the loss of Abraham Lincoln as president at the moment that Reconstruction begins is, I think, a catastrophe of absolutely imponderable proportion. And so I wanted to show that, and then I also thought that I wanted to make sure that somewhere in the movie you heard, as I said, the greatest political speech ever made, and that a president at the moment of great triumph stands up in front of the country and says, we may have paid this horrendous price, not because God is on our side and not on their side, or, we may be paying this price because we've all benefited, we've all profited from the horrible sin of slavery, and we may have to shed blood and lose all of our wealth, to sort of correct some karmic imbalance in the universe as a consequence of this. It's a stunning thing that a president could speak that kind of truth to a country that had suffered so much and that was at this point ready to celebrate victory. And I thought that's the way to end it, and I'm really happy that it ends with as his inaugural address did, with all nations. I mean, that it's uplifting, and it broadens the horizon from a domestic scene into a global scene.
Of course, here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, I love this to be a trilogy, but someone has asked, will there be a prequel to this movie?
Buchanan, the man.
If Steven Spielberg and Daniel Day-Lewis ever wanted to do anything more with Lincoln, I would, absolutely drop everything I was doing to do it with them.
That's interesting.
I think it would
heard it
be
here first. Yeah.
But having said that, I feel that it's not too much. I can't imagine that in my lifetime there's going to be another Lincoln, a performance of Lincoln comparable to Daniel's, and I can't imagine why I'd want to work on him as a dramatic figure unless this guy was doing it. And I kind of suspect that Daniel really did what he came to do with Lincoln in this movie. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he'll sign up for a series next week. But I think that we sort of all feel really happy with what we did. And
let me just ask you also very briefly, the filming in various places, Richmond, etc. Thaddeus Stevens' office. Do you remember where that was filmed?
Yes, it's filmed in the state capitol at Richmond, as most of the movie was.
Okay.
Off on one side in a kind of conference room, I think. I don't know that the room had any, but they made a desk and a thing.
It looked very much like the Treasury Department, where Andy Johnson, in the 6 weeks before Mary would finally be kicked out by him, stayed in the White House. It looked just like his Oval Office overlooking the Executive Mansion at the corner there. And I wondered if
we filmed nothing in Washington, D.C. The entire thing was shot in Richmond and Petersburg.
Something else that was brought up.
But it had a good door. That door slammed.
It had a great door.
Cough off.
They had good doors in the state.
They had good doors. Yeah.
Video Village was propped up against the statue where Robert E. Lee took command of the Confederate armies, and
that is a tough place to film in because you've got that hugely interposing statue of Robert E. Lee.
Well,
that's everywhere.
We didn't film in that room.
I know.
The really terrifying thing was the rotunda, which has the Houdon sculpture of Washington, which is the only statue for which Washington actually posed. So the value of it is, beyond imagination. And they put sort of chicken wire around it, but there are these Teamsters going by with these booms and it was like Grand Central Station there, and everybody, all Kathy Kennedy was standing there, just like white knuckling it every time we switched shots, because you were sure that somebody was going to swing a boom mic and knock Washington's head off. And thank God that didn't happen. We took very good care of him.
Appreciate. Of course, we thank your publishers for bringing you in, and it's your support out there that helps the publishers bring great authors in like this to
Can I
the
just
shop.
jump in and say
Please.
that I want to
Can't
thank
believe I
you.
sneezed at the end.
This-
Sorry.
This bookstore, which I discovered a few years ago, is a national treasure, and it's an enormously important place. And so I'm really thrilled that we got to do this here, because
Well,
I
thank you,
think
Tony.
this is really an
I
extraordinary
know the story
thing.
that you had heard that Seth Graham Smith was here for Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter,
Right.
and you said, I need to follow that up.
That's when I got the idea that we should launch this.
He
great
bit you
publishing.
here, right?
Exactly it. Exactly it. So again, thank you all, and I thank the staff of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop for all you do. Without you, we couldn't make these shows exist. Thank you again for being with us.